is Bean to Barstool, a podcast that looks at the intersections of craft beer and craft chocolate. My name is David Nilsson. I'm a professional beer writer and an advanced cicerone, and the creator and host of this show. The music for this episode is by my dear friend, indie folk musician Anna P.S. You can find out more about Anna's music in the show notes or at her website, annapsmusic.com. You can find links and information about our guests in the show notes as well. I hope you enjoy this episode of Bean to Barstool.
And then I met Sam, and he was willing and happily to do experiment with me. It was a great idea of saying, well, why not? You know, we have all types of fruits being used, from berries to tropical fruits to citruses. So why not use cacao pulp?
That's Leila Carvajal Erker of Cocoa Supply. We met her back in episode 62, where she introduced us to her company, which imports cacao products directly from Ecuador and supplies quite a few craft breweries here in the United States and Europe with cacao nibs. In that conversation, she mentioned Cocoa Supply was working on pasteurized cacao pulp products and was hoping some brewers would be interested in working with it. I was fascinated to hear this, as I was only aware of a single brewery up to that point that had worked with cacao fruit pulp rather than roasted nibs. I reached out to my friend John Nogsky, the head brewer at Fifth Street Brew Pub here in Dayton, Ohio, about experimenting with the pulp, and Leila also put me in touch with Sam Mosle at Wind River Brewing in Pinedale, Wyoming. Leila and Sam met at the Craft Brewers Conference in May, just kind of by chance, became friends, and luckily for us, Sam was interested in working with this new cacao product Leila told him about. Both John and Sam brewed blonde ales using the cacao pulp to get a feel for flavor and process. I had the chance to visit with John in person at the brewery and taste the finished product, more on that later, and I got to talk with Sam and Leila recently about the pulp and how Sam used it in the brewing process at Wind River. We're going to listen to that conversation today. Here's Sam Mosle and Leila Carvajal Erker. Well, Leila and Sam, thank you both so much for joining me today. We're going to be talking about a beer that Sam brewed at Wind River Brewing using cacao pulp from Cocoa Supply. Sam, at the outset, tell us very briefly the beer you brewed and what kind of flavor profile you're getting from that, and then we'll talk about the process.
Sure. So I started out with it's a blonde ale that we used to try the cacao pulp, and the blonde it's not really bitter. It's a fairly light, neutral flavored ale, if you will. Light in color, fairly light in flavor, notes of light breadiness, maybe light notes of citrus, but very light on that. It's kind of an easy drinking beer.
And have you had a chance to taste it since you've aged it on the cacao pulp?
Yeah, so I didn't necessarily age it on the cacao pulp. I fermented the cacao pulp during a secondary fermentation. So you go through your first fermentation, and then once that starts petering off, you're measuring your gravity on your beer. And by doing it multiple times, you kind of know where it's going to end at. So right where it's right at the end of its primary fermentation, that's when I introduced the cacao pulp. And my reasoning behind that is because I don't want all the volatiles to get blown off during that primary fermentation. So whenever I add fruit or adjunct, something that's going to ferment, I like to add it right at the end of that primary fermentation. That really helps preserve the flavor of whatever ingredient that you're going to be adding.
Well, we'll talk more about the details of that process in just a little bit. Leila, I'd like to hear about how you and Sam got in touch. I understand this goes back to CBC this year. Is that right?
And that's correct. I think there was a get-together that was rained out. So we were sitting inside. I was just sitting there. And for any reason, we started talking, and it was like, oh, what do you do? Well, I'm here in the brewery. And I was like, well, I'm just a cocoa supplier, and I'm just looking for guinea pigs to try this product that I have. And we were talking, actually, before that, we were talking a little bit of what we do. And I was explaining what we do with cocoa and cacao and what we do with in origin, that I'm from Ecuador. And Sam was also very interested in the sourcing itself and the social responsibility, what we do as the farmers. So it was a little bit of connection in the sense of having, I guess, similar values and things that we want to do with our work. And then eventually came out with, hey, yeah, I have this product and I'm looking for people to try it. And he was like, oh, I'll give it a try. I like to experiment. And I was like, so it was a very organic connection. And I have to say, I like this type of work the best, because this is when the connection is not only, hey, I have a product, try it. It is also, Sam will know too, that this will eventually help that we do more products from the farms for the farmers, and it also gives them an additional source of income. So I think everything is interconnected, and I'm loving the idea that he got to try it, and I'm here to hear all about it too, because this is the first time I'm talking to him ever since, and I'm excited to hear more about what came out.
Yeah, for sure. Sam, it's pretty common in brewing, of course, to work with cacao nibs. Working with the pulp is a pretty new idea. I assume you have probably brewed with cacao nibs at some point.
Yeah, cow nibs is quite popular, especially in doing something like a stout or a porter, aging it on cow nibs to give it more of a chocolatey taste, and also it gives you a mouth feel. So when you drink it, it's a lot smoother when you age a beer on cow nibs. But yeah, the pulp is. I never even knew the pulp existed. Leila told me about it, and I was naturally interested, and here we are today.
Well, Lila mentioned that social component that you guys were talking about. Did you have any familiarity with kind of what was going on behind the scenes with cacao?
No, to be honest, she showed me the whole process. We were sitting in there. It was getting rained out, and it was like, well, we made friendship and kind of just started talking, and she was kind enough to show me the whole process of what goes on. It was very eye opening, very interesting to see what goes into making the fermented bean of cacao.
Well, Lila, let's talk a little bit about the product itself and the motivation that went into this. This wasn't something necessarily that brewers were proactively asking you for. You recognized an opportunity. Talk a little bit about why you developed this cacao pulp and how it helps the farmers at origin.
Sure. The pulp itself is usually a waste product. Partially, you use part of it to ferment the beans, but some of it is usually taken out and it's just used in the farms. Normally, we make juice with it, we make jam, different things, but it's not really commercially available. Normally, it stays there. And what we always thought is, well, it's a pity because it's actually very tasty. But then comes the part that comes with how do you bring it from the farm, and it ferments very quickly. It's something that if you once you harvest it, you need to really freeze it immediately before it starts fermenting. It starts to, and so the first question was, how do you even do that to make it commercially available without all the refrigeration, without having to go, because that makes it already a more expensive, b more complicated, and c it's also environmentally even less friendly if you have to keep it cold all through all the chain. So I always say, well, we need to make it something easy. And then with a farm in Ecuador, we were working together, and we were like, well, this is how you normally do baby food. So this is how you have the pouches are normally how the baby food comes in. So we started to think on that. And the first idea was again more into juices, into what is traditionally used, puree, everything that has to do fruits. And then we have breweries that use nips. We have a lot of them, and I like to try them normally. I actually order every once in a while. They don't even know that I order their beer and get it and have a taste of it. And then at some point, I was like, this would actually be also good with cacao, with beer, with the lighter ones. I was having some that had citrus, or some that had, well, raspberry or strawberry. And one person actually asked me for, we have the freeze dried fruit for the passion fruit. We have that too from the farm. So I was like, oh, I'll send you some samples. And I was like, hey, have you ever brewed with cacao pulp? And I was like, no, not really, but we left it there. Then I decided to go to the brew expo, and I was looking around, and I was seeing all those fruit, the pulps, the flavors, and I was trying a lot of them too. Delicious. So I was going there and I was like, okay, this is actually, it was something that I didn't go to the expo looking for it. It came as I was walking by and seeing all the different flavors that were being developed. And I was like, then this idea came again, well, why doesn't it do it? And the first thing I Googled, and as I said, I found maybe one that was using it, but not really clear how. And then I decided to ask actually the puree manufacturers, do you actually have cacao fruit? Do you have cacao fruit? And then I sat together with Sam, and I was like, hey, have you ever tried it? He was like, I don't think he had ever heard about it, So I was like, okay, maybe there is something. And that's a little bit where I was like, let's just investigate and experiment. And I like to experiment. I think the first thing that we even got it into the market with the pulp is already the first step to something new. So right now, the more users we get, the same as nips. Nips were used at the beginning just to make chocolate. Now it's, I think, almost all breweries, or it's pretty common to use. So this is something that eventually, if we get this waste product to be also useful, then I think it's a win-win for everyone. We have a new variety of flavor, and we have something that goes back to the farmer where they can have something that is usually a waste product.
Absolutely. You mentioned working with one farm in particular. It sounds like, are you just sourcing from one farm, or do you hope to be able to get this from multiple farms you're working with?
We can get that from multiple farms. We just have to, because it oxidizes very quickly, it needs to be frozen immediately so that we do that. So we know already right now we have two different farms that are doing it, but it needs that component of where they can have it frozen quickly because of the fermentation. We don't want it to over ferment because then the flavor is completely different.
I know you're selling two different products. You've got the puree and then a freeze dried version. Sam, which of those did you use in your blonde ale?
It was the puree.
Okay. So, Leila, looking at the puree, can you talk a little bit about the process? You mentioned this is kind of an urgent process as soon as that's harvested because of how quickly it can ferment and
Yes.
perish. Can you share with us kind of that rushed
Sure.
process you have to go through?
Well, at the beginning, when they're harvested, they already normally when you have regular cacao, you harvest it, and normally it's the hands. It doesn't matter if it gets a little bit dirty because it is actually just for the fermenting, and the beans have a shell, so it doesn't really matter at that point cleanliness. When you use it for pulp, then you need to have rubber gloves. You need to make sure that everything is as clean as possible going into the buckets. They're harvested like they take the pot, they open it, and then they take all the seeds, put them down in a bucket so they're there. And then you have a centrifuge that takes some of that pulp away. You leave some of it because it's needed for the fermentation of the beans too. But that puree, that is the one that then it's sealed and put immediately into freezer. And that's the one that then once we get it in the factory is then passed through pasteurizing. That's why it's a little bit more caramelized than the powder. The freeze dried powder, on the other hand, is put straight into the freeze drying. The puree needs to be ultra high heated for a short time, and that's what caramelizes it a little bit. It becomes a little bit brownish, but then it becomes shelf stable for about 18 months. That's what we normally have as a shelf life.
So, Sam, the first thing a brewer does when they get a new ingredient is pop some in their mouth, right, and taste it. What did you think when you got these little packets of the puree? I assume you tasted one right away. What did you think?
You always gotta taste any ingredient that's gonna go into your beer. It has this distinctive tangy. It's like tangy and sweet all in one. It's actually quite pleasant, and I think they came in. I think it was 4 ounce packets, and it was delicious. It really was. So to think that that was a waste product, it's like a tangier applesauce, if you will, and a smoother consistency than applesauce. Quite pleasing to eat just on its own.
Yeah, I know. I talked with another brewer near me here who worked with the same cacao pulp, and he's got a daughter, I think is 2 years old, 3 years old, and he said he took a packet home and she was just sucking on it at home.
Yeah.
So, Leila, knowing that it changes a little bit with this process, you mentioned a little bit of caramelization. Compare the flavor of this puree to the fresh from the pod pulp. Neither Sam or I have had the chance to taste that at origin.
Yes, actually the one that is closest to the actual flavor is the freeze dried powder because it is normally freeze drying does not change through heating any of the sugars. The only difference is I do think the puree, because it is a little bit caramelized, it gives it a deeper or stronger note than the powder itself. When you have the actual cacao fruit, it's very fresh, And when you use it as a juice, you actually add more water and maybe even a little bit of sugar. But it is a very fresh. I will not say lemonade, but it goes more towards that section which is refreshing, light, not that strong when we use it as a juice. And I think the freeze dried fruit goes very well with that. For me, the idea of the puree was it I do think as a flavoring agent, or in this case for beer, it could be a better choice, but I think it depends on what exactly you want. The other one is more like a lighter version. It has I do think it has less depth, but it's fresher.
Sam, let's dig in a little bit more to the brewing process where you were using this. Tell us a little bit about your brewery setup. What size system are you on?
So the brewery itself, we're on a 20 barrel system, and our blonde ale is our most popular selling beer here. And so I just took about 12 gallons from one of the large tanks. Once it got down to a gravity, I got it was down to 5 degrees Plato when I added the cow pulp to it.
I'm just going to jump in here real quick to explain gravity in brewing. Degrees Plato, spelled like the philosopher, is a measurement of gravity of beer at various points in the brewing process. Gravity refers to the weight of the liquid and tells us the amount of dissolved solids, most importantly fermentable sugars, left in it. By measuring gravity at the beginning of the brewing process, at the end of the mash when the starches in the malt have been converted into simple sugars, and then measuring it again at the end of fermentation, we can use a simple formula to calculate alcohol content based on how much sugar got fermented. Brewers can use gravity readings to tell when fermentation is almost complete, when to end the mash, or even when something has potentially gone wrong. Brewers usually use the Plato scale to measure this, but you might also see specific gravity numbers, which are a more literal figure showing the weight of the liquid relative to water. A simple formula can convert Plato to specific gravity and vice versa. For those of you who read our print beer zine, Final Gravity, the zine's name is a reference to this measurement when taken after fermentation. If you want to learn more about the basics of beer, you can listen to episode 61. Now back to Sam.
We'll be right back.
Hey everyone, Final Gravity Issue 5 is now available in the shop on beantobarstool.com. This 5th issue of our zine telling personal, human-centered stories from the world of beer is full of great articles. Bano Segudu tells the story of the South African beer style Umkombothi, poignantly explaining its role in her culture and the importance in her family's celebrations and milestones. Maria Krugliak writes about discovering the Portuguese half pint after moving to Portugal during the COVID-19 pandemic. Amanda Bruns and Obakeng Malope discuss the water spirit Mamuhaswa and the collaboration beer they brewed in her honor. These and numerous other stories fill the 56 pages of this zine. We've expanded it and added a few features for this issue. It's full color, full of lots of beautiful photography and art. Definitely check this out. It's on beantobarstool.com/shop. You can purchase this issue or subscribe, and you can always support us on Patreon and get extra perks as well. Cheers.
So I pulled 12 gallons from our blonde at 5 degrees Plato, and I combined 165 ounces of the cacao pulp with it. So about 10% by volume cow pulp to the blonde ale beer in this experiment.
I don't know that we have exact figures for this, but either one of you, do you happen to know how much sugar content that would be adding for potential fermentation?
That I don't know, but I can tell you it's fairly high in sugar, the cow pulp. Leila might have a better understanding on the actual numbers of grams that's in a serving.
Yes, it is actually high in sugar. It actually has a very high Brix value, and that's exactly how you normally also, when you receive the beans, you know if water has been added or not. It's based on the Brix value when you get the beans. Let me see if I can find the nutritional values that we have. So per 100 gram, we have sugars, about 9 grams of sugar.
Sam, did you see much boost in alcohol from those sugars re-fermenting compared to what the base blonde would finish at?
I don't have a device to measure alcohol directly. All I go by is change in gravity, and that's what I'd say 95% of microbreweries are doing, because that alcohol measuring device is inhibitively expensive. I did notice an uptick in fermentation after adding this pulp, and I did notice some different metrics on the final beer in comparison to just the blonde without any cacao pulp added to it.
How long did that take to ferment out?
It took an extra 3 days versus the regular. You add a little bit more sugar, and I let it go for 3 more days or so. It was a very normal response to adding a fruit puree to a beer. There's nothing really out of the ordinary.
Hearing Leila talk about these subtle differences in the flavor with the fresh freeze-dried version of the pulp, what do you think you might do differently, if anything, if you were to work with that compared to the puree?
I'd have to get it in hand and I'd have to taste it myself. But honestly, I would probably treat it the same. Are you going to notice those subtle differences with, fermentation going on, as well as the complexity of the beer itself? I would say that most people would not be able to. In the raw product, you probably could, but in beer, I'd be hard pressed to believe that your everyday beer drinker would be able to tell the difference. I would probably treat them the same. Maybe rehydrate the freeze dried and probably treat it exactly the same as I did with this one.
Well, working with the blonde ale as a base to kind of get a feel for the ingredient, what are ideas you have going forward that you might like to do with either of these products, other beer styles, other ways you might want to use it? What are ideas you've thought of?
Yeah, so in terms of metrics, our blonde finishes at about 1.35 degrees Plato, where the blonde with the cacao pulp finished a little bit lower, finished at 1.25 degrees Plato, so zero 0.1 degree Plato lower. And that is probably attributed to its higher fermentability than traditional wort. The most notable change was in the final pH of the beer. As I mentioned earlier on, that the taste of this pulp, it has kind of a tangy flavor to it. So it's not super surprising that it resulted in a lower final pH. Because it's going to have some acidic properties to it. Our traditional blonde finishes around 4.4 pH, and the one with the pulp finished at 3.92, so almost half a degree of pH lower, and it's noticeable when you try it. There's a little more tang to that beer. If I were to use it again, I don't think I would use it in a blonde, but I think it would be perfectly fit for a wheat-based beer. I think a cacao pulp Hefeweizen would be phenomenal, or even doing a sour beer flavored with the pulp. That tanginess is going to play into the sour. With the blonde, there's too much going on with it, with the tang. It's not off-putting by any means, and maybe it's just because I expect the blonde to taste a certain way, and so having a tang in it makes me almost think that there's a contamination issue, and you got acidity from that. But if I were to do it again, I would try it in a Hefeweizen or a sour beer. I think it'd pair wonderfully with either of those.
Yeah, those sound really interesting. Do you think you'll have the opportunity to experiment with those?
I can only hope.
I was kind of curious.
Count me in. I'm sending you another one of those pouches. I would love to hear that too.
Yeah. Yeah, I am particularly interested in the sour there, since you're already getting that lower pH. It feels like that's just going to serve as a nice little boost. Yeah, and basically like a floor device or something, but with cacao.
Yeah. And as I mentioned, it wasn't off-putting, but to me, I like a really balanced beer. And with the blonde has maybe a little bitterness, and so the tang with the bitterness of the blonde, to me, it was too much. It was too busy of a beer with it. So yeah, I think, as mentioned, a sour or a light Hefeweizen would pair really well.
Do you think there's any avenue, if you were to keep the bitterness down for that cacao flavor to work with the fruitiness from like late edition hops? I mean, to any kind of like hop forward but not hop bitter beer?
Yeah, it's not like a fruitiness like tropical fruit. It's not like a fruitiness that you get from some hops. It's hard to describe because it's a very unique flavor. And the fruitiness is very subtle with the cacao pulp. It's a very subtle flavor. I don't think I would try it with an IPA, but I don't want to discourage anyone that has that idea. You know, that might be a phenomenal adjunct to add.
Leila, when you were going into this, I know you were just kind of looking at this as an experiment to see what brewers can do. Did you have anything in mind, or do you have any ideas for how you think this might work in different beer styles?
Well, again, I saw some beers that were using passion fruit or other tropical fruits, and even though it is not exactly the same taste profile, but I do usually like the combination of sweet and sour. So for me, the pulp has that combination that could be using that. So as I said, I didn't necessarily go into the trade show with that idea, but when I saw it and when I saw that there was this possibility that no one was using it, I'm very happy to hear more or less what Sam found out, because I would not be able to do that myself. I don't have the knowledge nor or anything like that. I only know cacao. So again, for me, knowing that these are future possibilities, it's, innovation is a little bit of an investment, and sometimes you don't know what you're putting out, but might come back, and it's exciting. I think that what keeps also I think always craft industry are the innovators. They're able to do these experiments without all the hassle of having to go through an RD department and all the budgeting and everything else. We can just say, hey, this is a good idea, maybe let's try it, why not? So I'm willing to even continue to experiment, because I do think that it can bring something new to the market. And I think that's also what craft industry needs. It needs this innovation to keep the people interested. Once, the bigger ones catch up to the craft market, then we're already up to the next task.
Sam, is this beer available at Wind River? And if so, what has the response been like so far?
So right now it's our busy season. So I yielded off that 12-gallon batch and then probably 13 gallons with the cow pulp. I yielded just about 12 gallons. So the pulp does kind of coagulate with the yeast, and it settled out. And so as you would expect, you have a certain amount of loss. I have it in a keg right now, and I'm waiting for a tap to open up to throw it on.
Do you
And
anticipate any kind of consumer education issues with the idea of cacao pulp? I feel like most people don't even realize that chocolate's
right.
coming from a fruit. So what are you going to do, if anything, to kind of help taproom customers understand what they're getting?
Sure. So I like to educate the servers at the bar so that they know what's going on, and I'll essentially just let them know that, hey, there's a cacao plant. That's where we get cacao beans, and in between the beans there's a pulp, and this pulp is very sweet, and we have experimented with this pulp in this beer, and just let them advertise it to the customer and say, hey, and we might end up serving our traditional blonde in conjunction with this experimental blonde with the cacao pulp fermented in it, so you can have a reference of, oh, see how much of a difference it actually made in the final product.
Leila, you had this idea, you decided to innovate with it and see if it would go anywhere. Where are your kind of thoughts and feelings at right now with finally seeing a few people getting to experiment with this and possibly more going forward? What are you feeling?
Well, it's certainly exciting. It's like an idea that came out a little bit from just sitting around in the rain. And I do also like the idea that we're finding new uses for that. For me, it always goes back a little bit to what do we do with the cacao, the farms, to promote that. If we can get something that becomes, a specialty product, but still more known to breweries, I think it's spectacular for everyone. It gives, again, that little, how do you say that innovation, or that, we have something special right now that's not that common, that small brewers can show to try it. And I think everyone likes that about going to craft breweries to try the different flavor, to try the different type of beers. And it gives the farmers also that. And for me, it's just another product. Again, going out of the traditional, trying to expand to different markets with cacao and products that are from my country, Ecuador, or from any other cacao producing country. I love the idea of being part of any craft industry, and this is fantastic, and I like beer, so I'm happy to try some of them when I can.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I've tasted one of these and I can't wait to taste more. I hope this definitely catches on. A couple weeks back, I ran over to Fifth Street Brew Pub in Dayton to get a first taste of their new blonde ale brewed with cacao pulp. Head brewer John Nogsky used the same type of base beer as Sam did at Wind River, but with a few process differences. Instead of adding the pulp near the end of fermentation, he conditioned the finished beer on the pulp for a couple days. He also used less pulp, adding about 95 ounces in about 10 gallons versus the 165 ounces in 12 gallons Sam used. He did use a moderate dosing of acidulated malt, a base malt with some acidity to it, to accentuate the tang of the pulp. John and I sat in the tap room, originally built in 1856, and tasted the pulp, the base blonde without the pulp, and the finished blonde that had rested on the pulp. The pulp itself reminded me of peach baby food. It has a touch of the smoothing sweetness of oxidation, so it isn't as bright as fresh pulp, but the flavor is very pleasant, like a little bit of passion fruit and peach puree mixed into applesauce. The blonde ale with pulp was quite good, showing that stone fruit influence with a bit of cider-like tang and a bready, pale wheat bread foundation. My wife Melinda and I came back in the evening and enjoyed a pint of the beer on the brewery patio, and it felt like such a great midsummer beer. Not the audacious fruitiness of those first spring or early summer seasonals, but still sunny and warm as the calendar flipped toward August. The advent of cacao pulp in modern brewing is so exciting to see, and I can't wait for the possibilities for this ingredient. I think it shows a definite promise for light sour ales, like Sam mentioned in particular. If you see or hear about a brewery working with cacao pulp, please let me know. If you have any questions or comments about today's episode, please reach out. Leave us a review on your preferred listening platform and check out the show notes for links to things mentioned in this episode. Thanks to Leila and Sam for coming on the show today, and to all of you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Bean to Barstool.